Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jesse. I will be moderating this event. We're talking agroforestry in practice, adding perennials to the Farmscape. And I will be here to help kind of bridge the gap between the speakers and the farmers to kind of help facilitate that a little bit. I'm the host of the Growers Daily, a daily podcast on farming that is available through YouTube or through wherever you get podcasts. Through the No-Till Market, through the No-Till Growers Network, and also I am here to answer questions as well. If you all have any questions, or if I can be of service in terms of facilitating this conversation, and I'm not going to take up too much time because there's so much great information that you all are about to hear from Daniel, from Ian, from Margaret, from Marissa. You've got some amazing speakers today, and I'm kind of excited to just kind of get to hang out and listen to them too. So without further ado, Marissa's going to introduce herself and talk a little bit about her project and what's going on here at OAK. And then, we'll get started. So thank you all. Welcome. And it's going to be a fun day.
Thank you, Jesse. So a little bit of housekeeping stuff first. The exits are in the back. If you didn't get a packet already, I handed some out, but they are at that back table where Jackson and Jesse are sitting at the break, so you can grab one of those. At the break, we'll also be handing out little feedback flyers that people can fill out at the end that are useful to us. If you need CEUs, you can sign up for those at the registration desk. And I'm Marissa Arnoldussen. I am OAK's soil health specialist. I've been with OAK for about a year now, and I've only been in Kentucky a year, so I'm still kind of new here. I've been in the PNW in New York prior to this, but I work on the Climate Smart project specifically, working with growers to do technical assistance, implement our practices for the project on their farm. The packet has some information about that, and I'll get into a little bit more details about it. But welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here and happy to get started. So I already introduced myself, I'm working primarily on the Climate Smart project at OAK. I'll be the one that does farm visits if any of you guys are in the project, me and Jackson. So agroforestry in practice, adding perennials to the Farmscape is what we're talking about today. So just a little bit about our Climate Smart project. If you're not familiar with it, we have a grant from the USDA to implement these practices on farms, a slew of practices. There's about 20 Climate Smart practices as defined by the USDA on farms. Growers get incentive payments for putting these on their farms. It's a 5-year project, so a lot of farmers are enrolled for all 5 years, and the idea is that every year we kind of are introducing new practices to their farm. If people are already doing these practices, they can still get paid for them. It's like early adapters. A lot of people are doing these already. We're providing technical assistance to kind of expand these on your farm, do them in more depth or in greater, kind of expand upon them. If you want more information about this, there's plenty of people at OAK that will talk to you about it. There's also information in your packet. But we're enrolling now, looking for more farms, so definitely learn more about it if you're a farmer in Kentucky. So the project is based on these NRCS practice standards. NRCS for each state has a field office technical guide where they have defined conservation practices. These are the ones that we're going to be talking about here today that are related to like the perennial plantings. And these are part of our project, and you can get incentivized for them. So the Field Office Technical Guide is an online resource through NRCS that outlines all these practices and gives guidelines to how they should be implemented. There's a lot of information on, for example, like what plants you would use, the plant density, when you should be planting them, how they should be established, how they need to be maintained, and the information you need to like provide to be incentivized for implementing them on your farm. And we are supposed to, through our project, we're supposed to be following these guidelines through the NRCS. Kentucky has most of these practices listed, but not all of them. So for some practices, we're using other state standards, but there's a lot of information that NRCS has developed for as like a resource, and as technical assistants, we are using these resources to help the growers implement these practices on their farm, similar to how it would be done if you were working directly with the NRCS. An important thing with all these practice standards is the practice purpose. So in each of these, when you're thinking about conservation planning and implementing them on your farm, it's important to define what specific goals you want to get out of these. For each practice, there's a list of purposes. A lot of them are similar. It would be like mitigating erosion, drift control, adding pollinator habitat, adding wildlife habitat. There are a lot of similar things for each practice, but they are unique for each one. So in the planning practice, you want to kind of pick out your top three or your top one to then build that practice upon. So it's important to kind of set ahead of time what the main things you want to get out of it are, and then when you go into those, or when your planner goes into the planning documents, there is specific information on how each of these should be implemented to get the specific benefit that you're looking for on your farm. So now we'll dive into each of these. So just again, when we're in our project, you would pick, or with the planner, your technical assistant, you would pick, we would help you pick exactly which of these practices is best fit for the situation on your farm. And there's a lot of similarities between them, but there are some unique differences between the practices, and we'll kind of help figure out exactly which one is best fit for your scenario. So field borders is the first one that we'll talk a little bit about today. And this is a strip of vegetation that's surrounding the field. Often it is when you're taking an area out of production, if you're on a larger farm, but it also can be just having an area that's not exactly in production but isn't really productive. It might just be a weedy area around your field that you would then plant into a pollinator habitat or perennial grasses or something that has a benefit on your farm to reduce erosion, protect water quality, or be a place for beneficial insects. And these need to be 30 feet wide as defined in the standard by NRCS. So vegetative barriers is another one. So this one doesn't have Kentucky standards, so if you're working directly with NRCS, it wouldn't be one you can implement on your farm, but through our project, we can implement it. And this is strips of vegetation that follow the contour of your field if you were on a slope and where water erosion is a concern. So the idea is that you would put these strips of vegetation in between fields or within a field to kind of reduce the flow of water down the field. Herbaceous wind barriers, this is very similar, but when we're looking at that purpose again, this is where wind erosion would be the concern as opposed to water erosion. And they are installed across the prevailing wind direction and kind of similarly built within your field to protect against wind erosion surrounding your crops. And these are generally small herbaceous or larger grasses or any about 1.5 feet tall herbaceous barriers that you can build within your field. And generally there's several rows of them built within your field. Wildlife planting, this is probably one of the most broad and wide open ones in terms to how it exactly looks on a field, but it's again taking areas out of production or taking kind of just an underdeveloped area and revamping it a little bit to plant for specifically wildlife habitat. So it's a herbaceous or herbaceous shrubby land that you're planting, so it would be a combination of annuals and perennials, often with the purpose being specifically for shelter and food for wildlife. And this is often used when you're converting cropland or pasture land to wildlife habitat. So you have some underutilized or unproductive land that would better be served in this purpose. This practice can be implemented there. Hedgerow, so this is one that a lot of people are interested in doing, and we will be doing a lot of in the upcoming year. It's establishing just dense vegetation in a linear design around a field. It's predominantly shrubs, and you're thinking about it in the longer term, so it's going to be in the ground for the longevity of the farm ideally, and you want to think about plant spacing and density in terms of what the things are going to look like when they're mature. But there's no, it's generally just one row of plants, no minimum width, and an average height of at least 3 feet. And this is distinctly different from this one, which is windbreaks and shelter belts, which you would also do like along your property or along field borders, but this one is more trees than shrubs. It's at least 3 different rows of trees or shrubs kind of spaced out or kind of offset to like mitigate drift or wind erosion or provide just some shelter around your farm. There's a lot of different purposes, but it's distinctly larger and kind of a bigger lift to put in a windbreak on your property. You need a lot more space to do this with the 3 rows of trees than you would a hedgerow. So a hedgerow is more suitable for smaller spaces, whereas this would be a much larger area that you're going to plant a windbreak in. And if you have existing windbreaks on your farm, like a fence line that's kind of overgrown, this can be a practice that you can implement to like revamp that, add more trees, take stuff out, maybe do some thinning and more selectively plant to put in a more beneficial windbreak on your farm. And then alley cropping is the last practice in our project that kind of fits this. It's a little bit different. Most of you guys probably know what this is, but it's kind of planting it would be 2 crops, like a tree crop and an alley crop in a pattern across your farm. So if you have like fields, you would plant some tree rows within these tree rows within your crop to kind of get an additional, make better use of your spacing, put in an additional crop, but also have some benefits of having like a mixed species in there. And this is another one, I think Kentucky just implemented. The NRCS just recently released guides on that, I think, but mostly all the research and documentation of this being implemented is coming from other states. There hasn't really been a lot that's been done with the NRCS in Kentucky. I'm sure there's probably people hear about it today, people that have done it on their own, but this is a newer one that we will be doing in our project. So that's all I have, but if you're interested in any of these and being paid to do them on your farm and getting technical assistance, then talk to us about it after, as again, we're looking for new people in the project. So I think next, if there's any questions, we can answer them now. Yep. It's called the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. And me and Jackson know about it, mostly Natalie and Brooke and Annie. There's quite a few Oak staff that are working in depth on it. Mm-hmm. Yep, so ideally you would enroll for all 4 years, and I think we're still looking for new farms. We have about 50 that did it last year, a little less than that, but we're gonna do probably up to 75 farms, so there's quite a few more spots for people. And there's a list of eligible commodities. You have to kind of be a specific kind of farm, but it's pretty diverse. It can be anyone from like a row crop grain farmer to a mixed veg farmer to a beef operation, so. Yep. Yes? It's a flat rate between $3,000 and $5,000, and then you can receive additional money for planting stock or like reimbursements for planting stock when we're doing these practices where you need to buy significant plant material. But yeah, some projects pay by acre. Since we're working with a lot of small farms, we just have a flat incentive rate that you would get each year. No, just 3,000 per year. Yeah, between 3,000 and 5,000, depending on what practices you're doing. Yes.
There are other conservation practices that aren't adopted by Kentucky NRCS. Is that a list of everything that the Climate Smart project covers?
Yeah, so there are maybe 100 or so like practices. Then there's a subset of that that's climate smart practices defined by the USDA. And different projects are working with a different group of those practices. So from that climate smart list, we have 20 practices. So not all of them are listed here. But in that packet, you might be able to find it, all the practices, yeah. There's quite a few more like annual based, like cover crops and tillage and yeah. Anyone else? Okay, we'll move on to Ian.
Good morning, everybody. That's me right there, isn't it? Today we're going to be talking about adding perennials to the Farmscape. My name is Ian Zeglin. I'm the Associate Director of Garden Operations at an organization called Greenacres in Cincinnati, Ohio. This will be my 14th season in agriculture, really focused mostly in mixed veg. I have some experience in cut flower and a couple livestock things. But we're going to kind of go over today some pros and cons to adding perennials to our farm. We're going to explore warm season native grasses, which I do want to give a caveat, is that I am in charge of vegetable production here. I am a part of the warm season native grass project that we're working on. And so I will hopefully be able to answer all your questions, but if I can't, I can point you in the right direction. And then we're going to explore my department, the vegetable production department's experience with hedgerows as well. And so to kind of start this off, Greenacres is a nonprofit foundation in Cincinnati, Ohio. We're really set up through the generosity of Louis and Louise Nippert in the late 80s. They basically kind of looked at the way the world was going and said, hey, we see that there's a lack of education in arts, in the environment, and in agriculture, and we believe in all three of those things, and they set up this foundation and set aside some land to be conserved and preserved for the intention of teaching. So that was about 40 years ago, and at this point we see something like 30,000 children a year. And from that also we've expanded to now have our own research department, and so we're doing a lot of partnered research with universities and research on our own farm to be able to put data behind some of these farm projects that we're doing. So I think I want to start this off by saying, like, some of our pros for perennials. I think it's very clear that perennials can add diversity to our farms. They can add diversity to our production, to our ecology. We know that they can be erosion control, windbreaks, and I think that one of the big pros is that they are low maintenance once established. And I think I want to make sure that we say that once they are established, they are low maintenance. Considerations for planting perennials, I'm not necessarily saying cons, but I think considerations is that they are an upfront investment in money, especially if you're planting out kind of a large hedgerow that can kind of add up quite quickly. They're an upfront investment in time. The way I like to think about them is you work really hard for the first year, maybe pretty hard the second year, and maybe by the third year it's kind of running on its own. So you have to kind of keep that curve in mind when planning these projects. They may or may not be financially productive. It depends on your purpose. But I think that's an important consideration because they can be a bit pricey to put in. And I think that they are really unforgiving prior to establishment. And what I mean by that is that curve of work that they are, you might put a great amount of work in year one to establish native grasses or to establish a hedgerow. And then maybe year two, you go, oh, I don't have to put so much work into it. And all of a sudden in August, you show back up and it's swamped. And sometimes you can recover it, and sometimes you're starting over, and that first year of work is all a wash. And I think that's really important to talk about. I see a lot of people talk about perennials like, oh, they're easy. You plant them, done, no big deal. They need maintenance, and if something goes wrong, they're really unforgiving. So I think that's important to kind of talk about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is warm season native grasses. We're going to go over the ecology of them and their benefit, their possible benefits for production, and some of their resiliency. And so when it comes to warm season native grasses, these are the grasses that were native to this area that have basically had a large decline from having other grassland species be introduced and be competitive with them, things like fescue and whatnot. Today we're going to kind of focus on three specific warm season native grasses. That's big blue stem, Indian grass, and little blue stem. Like I said, they're native to North America, but it's very rare to find large stands of them, which is immediately already for me kind of a sad thing. They're a warm season grass, or C4 grass, which means that they are built to thrive in the hottest parts of the year. They're deeply rooted. We're talking 5 to 12 foot deep roots, and they're all bunch grasses. And that seems like a minor thing, but to me, I think that's a very important part of establishing warm season native grasses for whatever purpose you are using them for, but especially for ecology. Is there a show of hands in here of anybody who recognizes this little guy? A couple of us. Yeah? So that's a northern bob white. The bob white population, a lot of times when I ask that and people raise their hands, generally it's a lot of our older generations that are raising their hands. A lot of people who grew up hearing these all the time, seeing them all the time. I'll tell you what, as someone who's 30-something years old, I've seen one ever. And I hear stories from older folks that say they used to hear them and see them all the time on farms. The statistic for these guys is that there's been an 80% decline in the last 60 years, which is an incredibly sad, sad thing. And northern bobwhites, their climate or their where they want to live is these warm season native bunch grasses. And the reason for that is bunch grasses don't grow like a stand of cool, like fescue or something like that. They have these large masses of grass with separations in between, right, when they're fully established. And so the saying kind of is if you take a softball and you roll it at a big tall stand of grass and it bumps against that grass and doesn't go anywhere, quail are not going to live there. If you have these bunch grasses with these little kind of tunnels that they kind of create in between them, and you roll that softball and it bounces around in there and it goes into the grasses, you have an area for quail. And so a lot of the dominant grasses in our area right now are not supportive of this. And also just conventional agriculture, we've pushed it all the way to the edges of fence lines. There is no breaks. There is no fence line shrubs or brushy areas for these quail to live. And the quail are just one species. There's multiple species that evolved and exist in our areas to thrive in these warm season native grasses. And unfortunately, we just don't have many of them anymore. I know grassland bird species are one of the largest in decline birds species, like groupings in this area. So it's important to understand that if we're going to support ecology, native grasslands are wildly underrepresented, and that if we want to use these warm season native grasses for ecology, I think it's a really good use of our time. Beyond, though, their benefit for ecology, they have a huge benefit for production. They can be used as hedgerows or breaks, but they can also be used to replace parts of pasture. Anybody who is a grazer will know that there's something called the summer slump, which is when all our cool season grasses start to decline in the summer. So in the spring, we have this big flush. That's that blue line there. And then in the summer, we have this dip. And then in the fall, we have another flush again. And so generally, a lot of grazers are just trying to get through the summer, right? But the thing that's incredible about warm season native grasses is they are thriving at that time of year. And so we've been working at Greenacres on a study with University of Tennessee to kind of look at the impacts of these kinds of pasture establishments as a way to help producers for grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And we've done a lot of trials on establishment, which I'll get to in a bit. But we have a lot of experience with this, and our recommendation is that if you are a grazer, if you're not doing this for a hedgerow, we recommend 25% of your pasture be allocated to these warm season natives. Like I said, you can graze them all summer. You can stockpile them if you want. I think that if you build them as a hedgerow, I have ideas that maybe you could pull them, cut them in the summer for straw and things like that for a garden. I think there's a lot of other production purposes for these hedgerows. And just an example of what this kind of grazing looks like in the middle of summer. As we were establishing these warm season natives, I had never been in a pasture full of them. But then here you can see in July of 2018, this is the farm that we were growing them on. The farm that we are doing this project on was continuous soybeans, no-till soybeans for like 30 years. And you want to talk about beat up soil, it's the worst you've ever seen. And so that being said, this is one part of the farm, this picture in the top right, and this is the same day. It's an incredible thing what these grasses can do once they're established, and it's kind of breathtaking when you see them in the middle of July and see these grasses really, really thriving. And so imagine if you're a grazer, that's exactly what you want to see right there in the middle of summer. In terms of resiliency of these grasses, like I said, we're talking about 5 to 12 foot deep roots. They can improve water infiltration. They can improve soil carbon. They're flood tolerant. They're drought tolerant. I mean, they're tough as nails once they get established because this is where we're evolved to be. And, I say all these things and you go, wow, warm season native grasses sound amazing and awesome and great. Why aren't they everywhere? Because they are not easy to establish. And so when it comes to establishing warm season native grasses, the number one thing there's a couple things that we really recommend. And the first is that you start planning early. You start getting ready for this. Site selection, deciding whether it's a wet site, dry site, deciding how much acreage you're doing, deciding what species you want to plant. And then understanding that if you're doing this as a hedgerow, this is not so much of a consideration. But if you're putting any part of your pasture into warm season native grasses, you have to understand that you are pulling that amount of your pasture out of production for multiple years. Year one, we say, with getting these established, you might have a 33, and I think that's a generous number, of the amount of forage you would have normally on that pasture, right? And that's year one. In year two, you're going to have 75%, and then by year three, we're looking at 100% of that acreage being back at full production. And so, as a producer side of things, taking 25% of your land out of production for really 2 to 3 years is again, it's expensive. This is not. There's reasons why we don't see so many of these warm season native grasses established. It's important to also make sure to plant in the spring or the fall. That's true for most of these kinds of perennial productions. When it comes to site prep, keys would be a clean, firm seed bed. And this is the one that I'm going to harp on basically for the rest of this presentation is minimizing competition for these grasses. This is the number one thing that you have to do if you want to establish these grasses. And like I said earlier, of kind of this upfront work is that you might do a great job managing competition the first year, but if you don't do it perfectly or you have a bad second year, you can lose these stands. And you imagine taking 25% of your pasture out of production or putting all this work into site prep for a hedgerow, you could really, really put yourself in a hole if you don't manage that well. Competition, minimizing it is key. And also removing thatch. We consider any leftover thatch, any kind of material on the ground left over from other weeds or whatever, that's also we've seen as a really big deterrent for these grasses to get going. And the reason that competition is so important to manage with these grasses is that warm season native grasses are root first, not shoot first, okay? And so what I mean by that is that you could plant fescue right next to a warm season native grass, and in 3 months that fescue could be, this tall, and in 3 months that warm season native is going to be the size of your pinky, right? The leaf coming out of the ground, okay? And that is because these grasses, they have those deep, amazing root systems, and they spend all of their time early putting all of their energy into roots, right? And so when you have a plant that is going root first, they're going to always be shaded out and competed from shoot first plants. And so that is why we really harp on this, is that you can see them get swallowed up immediately. These little guys are putting all their energy into roots, and without any kind of management, they get shaded out, and that's it for them. They really won't make it to the next year in that case. When it comes to seeding, this is the kind of percentage we use for any seeding, whether that's an acre or whether that's a smaller section. We say 10 pounds per acre. We say 6 parts big blue stem, 3 parts Indian grass, 1 part little blue stem. We found that to be really successful and really solid. And then there's this other part about seeding these and planting these is that they do well on your worst soil. And generally, I hate when people say that because I think that probably any plant would do better on good soil. But for this one in particular, I do like mentioning that because these plants are so tough and because competition is so hard. If you plant them in poor soil, they will generally survive. And actually in poor soil, there's less competition because less things are growing around them. And so although maybe if you're looking at this for your pasture or if you're looking at this for an odd part of your farm and taking the 25% of your pasture out, it can be your worst 25. And actually for these crops and for this planting and for the success of these, that worst 25 actually might be the best place for them. And so I think that's an important consideration. This is a kind of an illustration of the lasting impact of competition in these crops. There on the left there, that's September of 2019. You can see quite a bit. That's all junk. And then it was planted July 1st. By September, there's a lot of junk there. By June 18th of 2020, it's hard to see, but there's little tiny, I don't know if I have a pointer on here. I don't want to press too many buttons. You can see there's tiny little bunches in there. Those little bunches of grass popping up. Those few that you can see in that picture, those are the warm season natives. And then by 2021, there's a couple of bunch grasses getting going in there, but the rest of that is all weeds. And so you can imagine all the work, all the site prep, all the maintenance that went into this, and if we didn't do a good job of managing that competition, we're left with just kind of a little bit of what we're actually looking for. And even down here, it's trying to illustrate that thatch actually in that bottom right picture. Again, this farm is some of the worst soil you've ever seen. That thatch is from 2019, and that's one of the reasons that this stand had such a tough time. And in comparison, this is two different plantings with two different methods. On the left there is kind of what we were just looking at, is a couple bunch grasses and mostly junk. And on the right, that's like kind of what a well-established warm season native pasture looks like. Big bunch grasses, room in between. In the middle of June, it's glowing green, and it'll be glowing green all the way up until the end of July. And these are both after a controlled burn, which I think is really interesting. And so, again, hammering home over and over again, competition. You have to manage competition. And when I talk about managing competition, I wish I could come here and tell you it was really easy and really not too big of a deal, but that's not the case. I am no fan of herbicides, but we have done multiple trials. We've used nursery crops, we've tried grazing, we've tried mowing, we've tried prescribed burns. I'm not saying that there is a method out there that doesn't involve chemical controls that works, but from all of our looking into this, we have not found any, to be clear, that give you the success that you expect out of all of this work. Again, if you look at some of those old pictures, 3 years of a planting and then you're left with mostly weeds, if you're doing this for 25% of your pasture, that's a gigantic hit. If you're gonna pull that area out of pasture and plant it in warm season natives, you want to make sure that you have success. And so chemical control is what we recommend. I do personally believe that soil can handle acute disturbances in this way. I think that consistent use of herbicides is really, really where things get really terrible. But with that being said, I want to give you guys our recipe to make this work. Again, early prep is important. In the spring or fall, depending on what the ground looks like, we will do an application of glyphosate. If it's really rough, we'll do one in the fall, and then we'll again do one in the spring. Basically, and that's going to help wipe our slate clean. Once the slate is clean, we will plant. We basically 1 week after planting do spray a Mazopic, and then after that, we just mow for control. So what I'm talking about here is 3, maybe 4 applications of herbicide for a warm season native pasture. And like I said, I'm no fan of spraying herbicides, but 3 to 4 applications for a grass stand that's going to live for 50 to 100 years, be extremely productive, and improve soil the whole time it's there, and be extremely resilient. I can kind of see some wins there personally. And I will say, the second you go stand out in one of these in the middle of July when it's all established and amazing and you're hearing quail, to me, it's worth it, although this is a tough thing. And I know there's people still working on ways to establish these without chemicals, but right now, that's kind of where we're at. This is just an example of a Mazopic. This was planted July 1st on the left, and you can see it's starting to get swamped. And on the right there is after an application of a Mazopic, and you can see the rows of grass again. And then you can see a little bit behind it there, that's one of our control plots. And that, I can tell you, going out there now, that there's no warm season natives in that control plot with all that grass back there. We also tried burning as a way to prepare ground, and that has not been very successful. But we do use controlled burns every 3 to 4 years on these grasses and these warm season native grass pastures, and it's awesome. If you've never been part of a controlled burn, I highly recommend it. It is a bit scary, but it's not as hard or as scary as it seems like it would be. If you get someone who knows what they're doing, it's actually quite a painless process. So that's kind of like our warm season native grasses side of this presentation. Again, it's important that if you want these to put the work into them, and although chemical controls are a difficult thing for many of us, I do think that there's validity in them for getting these established. If you're doing a smaller hedgerow or a smaller area on the farm, you can absolutely get away with not doing it. If you can hand control the weeds, if you're doing an area at that size, you don't have to mess with those. So just something to consider. So the next part of my presentation is about our experience with garden hedgerows. So again, this is more of my lane of, on the farm. We're going to talk the benefits, establishments, and care. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about our research department and some of the data we have to back up some of the benefits, potential benefits of our hedgerows. So we began our transition. So we're on basically 4 acres of veg with only 2 or so in production a year. We're heavily rotating our plots. We planted our first hedgerow in late 2021. So I kind of say we started with hedgerows in 2022. Basically in 2021 decided to transition to no-till completely. And so as we took the tractor off of our farm, we decided to then take all those spaces and maximize our production space as much as possible. And then any space in between, since we don't need to move a tractor around anymore, we're going to put what I call ecological infrastructure. So hedgerows or other things of that type. So that's the size of our main part of our farm. And in those yellow boxes is where we have hedgerows currently, and plan to expand that quite a bit. So the benefits of hedgerows are things that we've all heard before probably, is that they're sanctuaries for above and below ground diversity. They're habitats and food sources for beneficial insects. There is potential economic diversity that they could bring. They can be used for wind protection, shade, visual markers, privacy, beauty, all of the above, right? And when we talk about beneficial insects, we kind of use that term very broadly, but there's a very real example that we've seen on our farm, is these aphidious wasps. Is anyone familiar with these at all? They're incredible little guys. So we use them in our greenhouse as a control for aphids. We can ship these in, and we do a lot of experiments with beneficial insects as a way to kind of see if how viable they are. And so the cool thing about an aphidious wasp is it will parasitize an aphid, which then will kill it, and then it kind of hatches, depending on what species of aphidius you have, it'll hatch out and then replicate and then parasitize other aphids, and you can use them as a control. In our greenhouse, or is where we get most of our aphid issues, we'll put these aphidius in when we start to see aphids. And then what would happen over the years is that they would handle the aphids generally, sometimes they wouldn't. And then all of a sudden, 6 months later, we have some kind of issue show up again, and we have to reorder these bugs, right? And it's not cheap. These are not economically that viable to order in aphidius, okay? But one of the things about the aphidious wasp's life cycle is that it will breed through parasitizing aphids, but it will survive and kind of keep kind of going if there is enough pollen around. And so in our greenhouse, we started planting with our production like heavy pollen producing areas of the greenhouse as well. And with that, we've seen that we brought in aphidius in spring, had some crops go. And then in the fall, 6 months later, we're having, maybe we started to see aphids pop up again, and we were seeing these aphidious wasps without adding them back in. And so I guess it's kind of a complicated way to explain that through having pollen consistently available, we're able to maintain populations of these beneficial insects. And so the reason I bring that up is I want to put a little bit more of this is a quantifiable benefit to a farm if we can keep these guys around. And having hedgerows that provide pollen for this species and many, 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 many others is a very, very valuable thing to have. When you're planting a hedgerow, there's, I think, a lot of considerations. Native plants, cold hardiness, how big it is when it's mature, its bloom period, shade tolerance, spreading tendencies, livestock compatibility if you're going to have livestock around. And this is kind of, to me, when I started getting started on this stuff, a very overwhelming list. At this point in time, I really, truly believe that you can just start with bloom period. And that's a great place to start if you feel at all overwhelmed by trying to figure all this out. And we have we put together these really cool little bloom charts for each hedgerow, and you can kind of see that this one here is butterfly hedgerow 1 has a really kind of nice, consistent amount of pollen throughout the year, a consistent amount of bloom period. As a kind of other example, this is mixed hedgerow too, and you can see its pollen is really heavily pushed to the later part of the year. The reason I kind of bring that up is I think that if this is a complicated process for you to start figuring out, if you start mapping out bloom periods and you know you want diverse and nutritious pollen throughout the whole season, this is just a great place to start. And it's where we started, and I found it to be really helpful. Another example of kind of a full season hedgerow of blooms, which is cool. You can also maybe, if you wanted to plant, if you were really technical, this is not how my brain works. This is one of our apprentices built this. That's mapping out the size, maximum size of each of these, and then planning it out that way. It's an incredible way to do it, as long as you can get the supplies you want or get exactly all the plants you want. But that's just another option, I think, to get your foot in the door for these kinds of projects. We tried a couple things with establishment here. We've done soil work, which is just disking or spading or hitting an area with like a BCS or something. We've scraped the top of the soil off with like a sod cutter, or on larger sections, just taking a skid steer and just scraping. And we've tarped areas. And then once we do that for establishment, we do maintain with either wood chips or landscape fabric. I think in terms of those 3 ways of establishing, if I would recommend them or say which particular cases they worked best, soil work, so like using a tractor or something, if there was a previously cultivated area, so we had an area that was like the edge of a production bed that was just a little too big, we didn't need it to be that big, I took the BCS, worked that soil, planted a hedgerow, it went great. There was no sod there or anything like that. If you're going to do soil work with an existing sod, you're just going to have to work it a bunch of times, which could be great, but can be a bit of work. We did do the scraping. I just don't recommend it. It sucked. We were able to scrape our sod off, put down some compost, and plant one of our hedgerow, our largest hedgerow in. But it was a ton of work, and we had planned to plant it in the fall. It didn't happen, as things do. And then we wanted to get it in by the spring, and so we had to kind of get after it. And when we did this scraping process, again, do not recommend it. But if you have to get something in, I think it works. But really, at the end of the day, tarping is what we prefer the most. If you can tarp something, again, in the same as warm season native grasses, planning far ahead is really where you want to be on these. You can tarp areas and really, really smother them for long periods of time. That has been our most successful cropping. Lightly. When it comes to planting, call up friends, especially if you're doing a large hedgerow. People love planting these. And it is, in terms of considerations for when to plant, you could do spring or fall, but fall is so much better, like by magnitudes. Spring, you're going to have to irrigate more because the crops are not going to be, or the plants are not going to be quite as established. But in the fall, if they have that whole winter to kind of, and early spring to slowly put down roots, we've found a much, much, much better establishment rate of these plants. In terms of sourcing them, local nurseries are fantastic. For us at this point, we've bought in a lot of our soft tissue, kind of our soft perennials. At this point, we just propagate them. We take cuttings, vegetative cuttings, a little bit of root hormone, throw them in some soil, they do great. But we do still always purchase in, if we're adding to any of these hedgerows or adding new hedgerows, we do purchase in woody perennials. Perennials already take 3 years or more to really get them to where you want them to be. If you're doing woodies, they're going to take even longer. And so if we're going to look at costs of these that make sense, once you have your soft natives to kind of propagate, purchasing in woodies is really where our recommendation kind of landed. Some other considerations is that propagating plants can become a source of revenue. I think that's important to talk about, and I think Daniel might talk a little bit about that. If you have livestock, which we do on our farm, we rotate livestock through our vegetable areas, there are some really important crops you should avoid, and I'll have a list of those in a second. Some natives work amazing for cut flower production. There is a lot of profitability in perennial cut flower plants. It's pretty impressive, actually. And so if you can have a dual purpose cut flower plant and a benefit to your ecology and your farm, that's a big win-win for me. And I also do recommend avoiding plants with rhizomes. We have this one planting that has, I think it's called ashy sunflower, and it has these like rhizomes, and we again, let it get away from us one year, and we'll never get it back. It's gone now. It's all ashy sunflower. So just being careful of rhizomes. They can just really, really be hard to get rid of if they start doing too well. These are our considerations for if you have animals around. This is not a totally unique list. There's some things like milkweed that are in our pastures, and I watch cows and stuff graze on them all the time, and they don't mind them too much. But there's things like St. John's wort can create photosensitivity in livestock, and literally their ears and their nose burn off. It's crazy. So there's some of these that can be actually really, really scary to have around livestock, and so really if that's part of your farm's, what your farm is doing, really, really please consider these if you're going to add these perennial productions. And then for cut flowers, that's a good list of things that we've found to be really, really beneficial. The only other recommendation I would have would be plant them in groups so that you can manage them all together. I think that's important. I can go back to that too if anyone, did everyone get the picture they wanted on that one? And then the last thing I'll say about hedgerows is they don't just have to always be plantings, or they can be combined with other things. Some of the stuff we're looking at is dead hedges, piles of dead logs. We're putting up hawk posts all over our farm, our garden space, to the dismay of our chicken producers on the farm. But we're hoping to kind of encourage those guys to spend as much time as they can in the vegetable field. We put birdhouses up in most of our hedgerows, and we've seen a lot of success with like tree swallow, like a bunch of new tree swallows on the farm and stuff like that. And then that left one there on the bottom is just like a corrugated roof. We learned that one from our environmental educators. They put those out as a place for reptiles to warm up and kind of hang out. And so when they have kids come around, they lift them up to show the kids all these cool reptiles. Well, we're finding that they're awesome for having a place for all reptiles to go. We've seen a big increase in our black rat snake population since going no-till after a big increase in our vole population. And they really like to hang out on our compost piles, and they start making nests and doing all kinds of cool stuff, and then we disturb them when we go to plant our compost. And so creating habitats for these guys I think is really important, and that's one we've just found is really, really easy and is pretty cool. The last thing I'll kind of talk about is like I mentioned, we have a research department on our farm, and they're able to collect a lot of data. And there's a number of takeaways that we have so far. I mean, we're only a couple years into our production here, our perennial productions, but specifically with the vegetable garden hedgerows, I think there's some cool data we've started to pull. We had a really awesome research intern who had this research question for a summer project. Like, how does the shape of a flower affect the diversity of insects attracted to it? Which I think is a pretty cool question. She looked at umbels, tubular, panicle, plume, ray and disc, like all these different kind of styles of flower, right? And really, she had a very long presentation, but to summarize it, this was a lot of her data. And really the key takeaway here is that the umbel flowers are honestly the most bang for your buck. That was the highest diversity of insects were attracted to that, and the most amount of insects were attracted to those flowers. So that's like yarrow, mountain mint. If you guys don't have mountain mint on your farm, I can't recommend it enough. It's the coolest plant to have. I've never seen more bugs on a single plant ever. And so I think that's a really cool thing. If you're on a budget and you want to start slow with these, yarrow, mountain mint, start there and see if you like what you're doing, and see if you want to add more. You can propagate those from cuttings, and so I think it's a really nice place to start. Again, if you're on a budget and you want to get bang for your buck. We've also, one of the cool things we started doing is we started our first full year with hedgerows was in 2022. And so we've been collecting data since then in terms of bug populations, density, species. We're still learning how to collect this data. We are in no way a gold standard for this kind of data. And also we're only a few years in, so any kind of data I'm gonna have here is not necessarily I can't say that it is a trend, it is a point of data. Is that, you know what I mean by that? Like, so I can't say that a lot of this is a bit anecdotal with a little bit of data on it. And so I'm not, in a couple years, maybe we'll have something a little more concrete, but I think it's still worth talking about. With the hedgerows from 2022 to 2023, we did see an increase in insects. The way we measure that is we take pan traps, so like little colored bowls with water in them, and the bugs will fly into them as if they're attracted to the flowers. They will then die in there, and then we identify them and count them. And then pitfall traps, which are basically just like cups in the ground that the bugs fall into, and we count them and monitor them there. So in 2022, that was our insects. In 23, we saw an increase, and then weirdly this year in 24, we saw a decrease. Okay, and we had more hedgerows than we've had ever on the farm in 2024. So that was a bit concerning for me, but there's two aspects of that I think are worth bringing up. One is that there is research papers that suggest that as the actual flowers increase on the farm, that the bugs are less attracted to the pan traps. You know, bugs are maybe hopefully going to go towards the actual flowers versus the pan traps, and that's been documented in research papers that is an issue, is if there are too many flowers, you won't collect as many bugs. So that could be a reason that we have had a decrease in insect data. Again, also we do not have a gold standard of data. But one of the things that I've kind of keyed into also is I think that there is an aspect of disturbance on the farm that could also be cause for that. I was lucky enough to go to Daniel's no-till intensive a couple years ago, and seeing his farm is an incredible thing if anyone can ever make a trip up there. But Daniel was very inspiring in terms of keeping a farm very neat, tidy, and weed seeds down. And I left his farm and was like, we are mowing like crazy now. And so we went from this here on the right was kind of, you know, it wasn't not often for our farm to get a little overgrown like that and not worry about it. And then on the left is kind of how we manage now, is really, really, really tightly mowed. And the difference between Daniel's farm and our farm was that he has really well-established hedgerows. We did not at this time. And so I do wonder whether or not there is a level of disturbance that we created that actually decreased our insect population. All those tall grasses for spiders, all those weird brushy edges that we didn't worry about previously. Yes, we're not getting weed seeds blowing in, but could we have impacted our insect population by mowing and disturbing too much? I think so, and I think that this year I'll be managing, as our hedgerows kind of mature, I think I'll be managing a little bit more to keep some areas wild or to create some more wild areas that are not disturbed. In that 4 acres of our vegetable fields, there's not a square inch that wasn't cultivated, mowed, or whatever this past year. And so I do think that that could also be part of the reason that we saw a decrease in insects this year. So whether it's that or whether it's because they're actually attracted to the flowers that were there, I can't say. In the next couple of years, hopefully we'll have more data to say one or the other. Birds. This is one of the really fun ones about that we've been tracking. So before we started tracking our hedgerows, our bird populations with our hedgerows to see if we were increasing our bird populations on the farm. So far we have. Between 2023 and 2024, we saw a 27% increase in birds on the farm. We saw an increase in bird richness, and overall just saw more, and even anecdotally, birds on the farm. You can see that's a kind of graph of them on the bottom. No lake or pond fish or birds yet, but I'm hoping to implement some of that on the farm as well to get our bird population up as high as possible. As a comparison, in 2023, we had 54 monitored bird species. In 2024, we had 71. I think that's a notable increase. Just so you know, the way we do this, we take the Merlin app. We have a recording device that records for certain hours of the day. We run that through the Merlin app, and it identifies birds. It's actually not that hard to do. It's a little bit of work in the winter to kind of catalog it all. But so yeah, the 71 species in 2024, and then in the pasture right next to where our production is we had 61 species. And so more species in even our pasture areas, which I think is really exciting. This is a really cool one, and again, this is not data we can fully say is like means something, but I think it's an interesting thing. These are our risers and fallers of the last year. So that's which bird species we saw more of and which we saw less of. And so we saw some really cool ones go up, but what's so interesting is the ones we saw down. We saw a marked decrease in house sparrows and European starlings. And that excites the hell out of me, because if we can have more bird species on the farm, a more diverse species of birds on the farm, and if we consistently see them outcompete some of these invasive species of birds, I think that's an incredible story to be able to tell about the hedgerows and about some of these perennial plantings. Strangely enough, too, again, this is totally anecdotal. I have this picture of this little baby killdeer. I don't know if you guys ever get to see those. It's my favorite part of the year when the little killdeers are running around. But we also saw a marked decrease in killdeers in this past year, in 2024. And again, totally anecdotal, but with transitioning in no-till, we started using a lot more mulches and straw and things like that. And we saw a pretty dramatic increase in slug population, right? And what we also were seeing and not realizing at the time is that our killdeers were just not leaving the farm. We had this from 23 to 24, we had this just huge population of killdeers that were like, what are they doing here? And then as the year progressed, they kind of ended up disappearing and not sticking around like they had been. And I just was like, oh, this is kind of, it was enough killdeers to be like, what the heck's going on? And then when they were gone, it was like, where'd they go? Killdeers are known to eat slugs. And so when I see this going down, I find it to be very interesting that there is a chance that these killdeers showed up, ate on a bunch of our slugs, and then left. And if that's the case, I think that's really cool. And again, an anecdotal but maybe slightly quantifiable benefit of having these kinds of environments for these kinds of beneficial birds or insects to be on the farm. And so with that, we had some incredible wins with some of these projects. Again, between whether you're doing native warm season grasses or hedgerows, preparation, managing competition, good planning is the key. Keeping up with them is the key, because if you let them go, it can be really, really tough. And so with that, does anyone have any questions for me? Yes, sir.
The parasitic wasps,
Mm-hmm.
how big a range do they have? Like, will they feed? I'm talking about in an outdoor environment, not in.
It's so interesting. There's so much different information out there. They say 400 feet from a pollen source, but if a bunch of aphids show up, they're going to show up. I don't really know. I do think there's a really interesting conversation about like hedgerows and pollen sources and proximity. We did a nighttime study this year of we looked at like moths and stuff at night to see what we had. And when we were close to the hedgerow at night with like a UV light, we're getting all these bugs. And then we walked out into the actual garden space 100 feet from the hedgerow and we got nothing. Again, that's a one-off. I don't know whether this proximity to these things is important or not, but I do think that there is a factor there. I can't tell you how far they range, but I think there's something there. Yes, sir.
On the warm season grasses,
Mm-hmm.
in the cool seasons, what are they doing? Do they make room for cool season grasses to come up, or do you want to suppress those to keep competition low?
Such a good question. Once they're established, they really don't, nothing much competes with them. If you can get forbs in that area as well, they will kind of coexist. Once they're about 3 years old, it's really rare for anything to outcompete them. In the winter, you can stockpile them or graze them down, and then what happens even like in a snow like this, the way that they're kind of what's left over the bunch grass and snow and things like that, that creates a whole other environment for stuff. And so, we leave yay of the plant. We're doing trials with trying to put cool season grasses like cereal rye in with the warm season natives, like maybe in fall to maybe get a grazing of the cool season grasses prior to the warm season. If it's possible, it's going to be incredible. So far, trials are like, nah. Once they're in there, that's their space. And so I think that there's farmer ingenuity is always amazing. I think it's possible, but generally once they're there, that's their space. Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. The question was cool season grasses competing with the warm season natives, and what we do with them in the fall, right? That was your question, or after they've been grazed. And so yeah, so there might be a way to seed something in and get a cool season grazing prior to the warm season. What forbs we like, I don't have that list on me, but if you would like that list, I'll give you my email and I will get that to you. Yeah. And we have the ones that we for sure have found success with and ones we've found not success with. Yes, sir.
I'll stay on the warm season grasses. Have you talked to any farmers who have basically let a fescue field go, and slowly over time, the warm season are coming back up? Basically, have you seen any natural regeneration type methods?
Yeah. So the question is have we seen any natural regeneration of warm season native grass pastures? No. Okay. No. Fescue beats everything. Kentucky 32, I think it's Kentucky 32 beats. It's tough.
When it's left alone, no more grazing, no more.
I think if that was the case, we would see a lot more warm season native pastures popping up around. And from my knowledge, I've not seen that happen. Is it possible? Again, totally, maybe. But man, it's since they are so slow to establish and fescue is really so tough, I can't see a path for that to work too well, unfortunately. Yes?
Have you trialed transplanting warm season natives? I know they're usually probably not the
Yep.
best for that, but and it's hard on a large scale. But I'm just curious about
Yeah, I think transplanting is for sure effective. At scale, I think it's not. Like I said, if you're doing a small hedgerow and you can have little plugs or something, I think that's totally effective to give them that head start. We've done even gallon pot plantings in certain areas, and those are successful because once they get, I mean, they're, as long as you can keep them alive, they'll just go. But in terms of doing it at scale, I think that's a really tough one. And the other thing is the seed for these aren't exactly cheap. And the transplants are even more expensive. All no-till drill, yes, correct. Yes?
If you're planting on a slope and you have kind of terraces
Mm.
or swales put in, would it make sense to put small hedgerows in with each of the terrace?
So the question is, if you have slopes and terraces, does it make sense to have small hedgerows in those spaces? I think it's important for the context of what you're trying to do. If it's an unproductive space for the farm, a hedgerow would be great. If it's a really productive space for the farm on those terraces, maybe a hedgerow isn't where they should go. But if you're looking at warm season natives or any of the perennial natives, there's something that lives perfectly well on that terrace in some capacity. So it would just be figuring out what that would be, I think, and then understanding the context of what you want it to do. But yeah, they can, once these warm season natives grasses get going, they're fine. Any other questions?
You talked just a little bit more before we wrap up for a break about the controlled burns.
Yeah.
Are you planning to continue that part of the project, or is that?
Yeah, we're investing more and more in controlled burns. We've really lost in general in agriculture that as a tool. And it's an incredible tool. I mean, seeing some of these warm season native grasses, the way they regenerate after these controlled burns is awesome. Like the black-eyed Susans always come up like crazy afterwards, and the grass comes up after them. It's really the way these ecosystems were meant to thrive, right? We are continuing to control burns. We're doing 1 to 2 a year, depending on the pasture. We're getting to the point where, if on this farm there's X amount of pasture, we kind of break it into like 3 or 4 sections, and then every year we're burning one of them, if possible. The thing about burns is you need very, very precise conditions. It could be, you can be looking at the weather and all of a sudden tomorrow is it, and you got to get out there and you mobilize a whole crew, and then you get out there and the weather changes and you have to stop. You need to talk to fire marshals, you need to have a burn boss, you need to have all these things in place, which can be a bit intimidating, but they're not as uncommon as you think they are, and they're not nearly as hard as you think they are, especially if you have an experienced burn boss with you. It's a brand new thing to me in the last couple years, and I have to say it's one of the funnest things of the farming season that we do now. And I highly recommend, if anyone has space that it would make sense, to explore controlled burns as a way of management or regeneration of pastures, especially these warm season natives. Yes?
I just wanted to point out burn boss is also a needed job. So
Great.
if anybody's looking for a career in agriculture, the burn bosses may have other people who can qualify to do it.
Yeah, become a burn boss. It's a cool job title. Yeah, one more. Yeah, this will be the last question.
This is just a follow-up on the burn. You noted that it really wasn't successful for establishment.
Correct.
Warm season grasses. Can you tell me just a little bit more about what's happening? Is it just like I guess the full seasons are still just coming up through the burn?
It's as a way to establish. Yes, again, shoot first versus root first. The shoot first, even after a burn, comes up quicker. Like I said, that warm season native grass will be the size of your pinky for a year, right? And so you have to keep everything else that gets bigger than that away from it, and the burn sets that back, but it does not solve that. And if you burn when the grass is that small, it will not survive, right? And so for establishment, it doesn't make that much sense. But once the grass is established, and the roots of the warm season native are established, they then outcompete everything. And so the burns don't really even set them back. They have 15-foot deep roots. They don't care. But it sets back everything else, and then they have so much energy and so much resources to pull from after that burn that they just go crazy. And so for management, it's really valuable. For establishment, it's not so much. And that's the last question. So thank you guys. Appreciate your time. Thanks, Justin.
All right, we're gonna take a quick break. We'll take 5 minutes and go get a drink of water, walk around, all that stuff, and then we'll come back and we'll have Daniel come up next.